They thought Noah would never move his legs. Then one day, he kicked just once and everyone cried. They thought the dog was just a stray. Then he became the baby's guardian, saving his life in the dark. They thought the mother would never return. Then she did, only to leave again. But now there's another heartbeat, another life growing. So the question becomes, what if this wasn't just a second chance, but the beginning of something divine? Before we begin this unforgettable story, would you mind sharing where you're from in the comments? And if stories of love, loyalty, and second chances move you, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Morning came slowly to Evergrove. The fog clung to the tree trunks like forgotten whispers, and the pavement of Maple Street gleamed with cold dew. Nestled in the southern curve of Oregon's forested hills, the town felt like a place the world had chosen to forget, and most of its residents liked it that way. But that morning, the stillness was broken. Inside a two-story cottage at the end of the street, Mark Dawson was already awake. At 34, he had the lean frame of someone who skipped breakfast in favor of caffeine and coding. His light brown hair was sleep-tousled, his glasses slightly askew, and his gray hoodie hung off one shoulder as he hunched over his laptop in the dim light of his home office. Freelance software development allowed him peace, predictability, and solitude, three things he valued more than he admitted aloud. His wife, Lena, was upstairs fast asleep after a double shift at the Evergrove Community Clinic. 32, auburn-haired, and steady as bedrock, Lena was the kind of nurse who could make a panicked patient breathe easier just by entering the room. She carried herself with calm efficiency, shaped by a childhood of caring for an ailing mother, and a stubborn belief that kindness wasn't just an instinct, it was a choice. The knock came once sharp and unexpected. Then again, louder. Mark looked up puzzled. It was 6:12 a.m. No deliveries, no appointments, no reason. A third knock, rapid and insistent, echoed through the house. He pulled himself away from the screen and padded barefoot down the hall. When he opened the front door, he was hit by a gust of chilled air and something else, a woman. She stood on the porch, soaked from the mist. Her long brown hair clung to her face, and her eyes, wide with desperation, seemed too large for her gaunt cheeks. She couldn't have been older than 30. Her hands trembled as she cradled a bundle tightly to her chest, a baby wrapped in a worn, faded blue blanket. The child was quiet. Too quiet. Mark stared unsure if he was dreaming. The woman stepped forward, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "Please," she said, "take him." Before he could respond, she pressed the baby into his arms. Mark instinctively caught the bundle, the warmth of the small body bleeding through the blanket into his fingers. The child stirred faintly but made no sound. The woman reached into the pocket of her oversized coat and pulled out a folded envelope. She placed it on top of the blanket, her hands lingering for a second too long. Then she turned and walked away. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came. He took a few steps onto the porch, calling out, "Wait, what are you?" But she didn't turn around. By the time he reached the sidewalk, she had vanished into the pale fog, swallowed whole by the still sleeping town. He stood motionless, heart pounding. The baby in his arms gave a soft sigh. Mark tightened his grip, not knowing what to do, only that something irreversible had just happened. A creak behind him. He turned. Lena stood in the doorway, wrapped in her robe, hair messy from sleep. Her eyes moved slowly from the baby to Mark's face. "What is this?" she asked, voice sharp but not angry, just stunned. Mark didn't answer. He held out the envelope. Lena took it but didn't open it. Her fingers hovered over the flap, then dropped to her side. Instead, she reached out and gently took the baby into her arms. For a moment, both of them stood there barefoot, breath visible in the cold air, a child between them and 1,000 questions unspoken. Across the street from a second-story window half obscured by curtains, another figure watched. Mrs. Edna Ramsay was not a woman easily surprised. At 71, she had lived in Evergrove longer than most of its trees had stood. Tall, stooped slightly at the shoulders with snow-white hair, always pinned into a precise twist, Edna had a sharp eye and sharper opinions. Widowed 15 years ago, she had since developed a habit of watching people's seasons' clouds, and she missed little. The Dawsons were new, but she had already taken note of their quiet, their routines, their tidy porch. Now, from behind her curtain, she watched them hold the child. Her lips thinned, and yet for the first time in many years she did not look away immediately. The mist had barely lifted over Evergrove when Lena finally opened the letter. The baby slept quietly on the sofa beside her, wrapped in the same faded blanket he'd arrived in. The edges were frayed, the fabric softened by time, and perhaps too much washing, but it held warmth. She sat beside him in silence, her thumb rubbing the folded edge of the paper, hesitant. Mark hovered in the kitchen, pretending to make coffee, though his eyes kept drifting back to the couch. Neither of them had slept well, not with the weight of that child resting like an unanswered question between them. Lena finally peeled the envelope open. Her eyes scanned quickly, then again, slower this time. Mark stepped into the room as she read aloud the woman's rushed, uneven handwriting, now their only clue to the child's story. She said nothing about a name, no birthday, no hospital, just fragments of fear and desperation, a plea that they take care of him, that she trusted Lena had seen her once at the clinic and remembered her kindness. There was something honest and painful in the tone, something final. They didn't speak for a while. The house was too still, the fog outside still thick against the glass. Later that morning, Lena called the clinic and asked for time off. The nurse manager didn't argue. Evergrove was the kind of place where gossip could outrun an ambulance, and though Lena didn't explain, her voice had sounded different, low-shaken, firm. She was granted 3 weeks. That afternoon she gave the child a bath. He barely moved, didn't cry, just stared at her with eyes too calm for someone so small. As she dressed him in a clean onesie and wrapped him in a fresh blanket, she leaned over, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "You'll have a name soon, little one." The next morning, the sun came out for the first time in days. Mark took the baby, still nameless, into the backyard, while Lena cleaned the kitchen. Their yard backed up to a shallow patch of forest, nothing more than a thin veil of trees and brush, often visited by squirrels and the occasional deer. But that morning, something else stirred. It was Mark who heard it. First, a rustle in the ivy that crept along the fence. He turned just as something small and golden bolted from under a bramble. A dog, thin muddy ribs showing. It barked once hoarse and uncertain, then darted behind a bush. Mark stepped back instinctively, shielding the baby. He called out for Lena. She arrived moments later, drying her hands on a dish towel, eyebrows arched. A stray, I think so, looks young, skittish. Lena's eyes softened. She knelt slowly, her voice gentle. "Hey there, sweetheart." The dog growled a low warning rumble, but didn't bolt. He was no older than 6 months, a golden retriever with once bright fur, dulled by dirt and neglect. His eyes were a soft amber rimmed with nervous tension. His tail was tucked, ears lowered, but he didn't run. Lena could see that he was hungry, not just for food, but for safety. The baby stirred in Mark's arms, let out a soft whimper. At the sound, the dog's ears perked up. He took a step forward, then growled again, quieter this time. Lena stood. "Let's not push him. If he's still around tomorrow, we'll try again." But the dog didn't leave. That evening he returned, curled up near the compost bin. Lena brought out a bowl of water and some leftover chicken. The next morning she found the empty bowl licked clean and 2 muddy paw prints on the back porch. By the third day, the dog began to follow her at a distance. He still growled whenever she held the baby. He'd barked once when Mark brought the child outside. It wasn't aggression, more like confusion, unease. Still, Lena was cautious. She called the vet and made an appointment, though getting the dog into a carrier would be a challenge of its own. "I want to name him," she said that night, watching the dog from the kitchen window. Mark looked over the rim of his coffee mug. "The baby or the dog?" She smiled. "Both. But let's start with the one who eats the chicken bones off our porch." She decided on Rusty because of his coat, because of the old warmth buried beneath the grime, because something about him felt like it had been forgotten, not broken. That weekend, Lena managed to coax Rusty close enough to slip a leash around his neck. He stiffened, then went still. She moved slowly, her voice soft and soothing. Mark stayed inside, holding the baby. When she returned from the vet, she had a bag of antibiotics, a health report, and a warning the dog had some trauma, but no sign of abuse. Likely abandoned. Skittish around loud noises, but not dangerous. Over the next week, Rusty began to settle. He still barked when anyone approached Lena while she held the baby, but the growls turned into wary stares, and the stares into quiet observation. Once, when the baby coughed in his sleep, Rusty stood up from his blanket by the back door and patted over, nose twitching. He didn't touch, didn't bark, just watched. The connection had started. Silent, unsure, but real. Across the street, Edna Ramsey took notice. Mrs. Ramsey had never been one for animals. Her husband had wanted a dog once, a beagle, back when they lived in San Diego, but military housing and her fear of messes had ruled it out. She remembered him bringing it up just once over coffee and a quiet Sunday paper. "We should get a dog," he'd said. Something loyal, something warm. She hadn't answered then, had changed the subject. Sometimes she wondered if that silence had echoed louder than she thought. But this morning, watching from behind her curtains, she saw the golden dog lying near the Dawsons' porch. The child sat in a carrier nearby. Lena knelt beside both. Rusty lifted his head, turned it slightly, and for the first time met Edna's eyes through the window. She didn't flinch. That afternoon, for the first time in almost a decade, Edna unlocked her gate. She stepped into her yard, watered her violets, and left the gate slightly ajar, just wide enough for a curious dog to wander through. The wind howled low through Evergrove that night, sliding between the pine trees and rattling loose leaves like old secrets. The Dawson house stood quiet, its windows glowing softly in the dark. Inside, the once foreign silence now held a rhythm, bottles sterilizing in the kitchen, Rusty's collar jingling faintly as he shifted near the back door, and the subtle rustle of a baby breathing in his crib. But that rhythm broke just after midnight. It began with a whimper. Lena was the first to hear it. She had been dozing lightly on the couch, her mind uneasy. When the baby stirred and let out a fragile moan, it wasn't the usual discomfort of a missed feeding. It was sharper, thinner, laced with something fevered. She was up in seconds, her instincts taking over. One touch of his forehead was enough. Hot. Burning. "Mark," she called already, lifting the baby into her arms. Mark stumbled from upstairs, still groggy. His hair stuck in uneven angles, and his t-shirt clung to his back. But one look at Lena's face told him what he needed to know. They didn't argue. Within minutes, the car was pulling out of the driveway, its headlights slicing through the misty dark. Rusty watched them go from the front porch, ears perked, tail still. He didn't bark, but the sound of the engine fading into the woods left him uneasy. Something was wrong, and though he didn't understand the full shape of it, he knew the child was in danger. At Evergrove General Hospital, a modest aging building with ivy crawling up one side, the emergency room buzzed with low lights and weary nurses. Nurse Camille took them in. She was in her late 50s, short and round-shouldered, her salt-and-pepper hair clipped into a practical bob. Camille had worked nights for over 20 years and had seen every kind of panic walk through those doors. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her voice was calm and measured, like a lullaby tuned to triage. She took one look at the baby in Lena's arms and nodded. "Let's get him inside." The next few hours were a blur of bloodwork scans, monitors, and antiseptic air. The pediatrician on duty, Dr. Harris, was a thin, wiry man with alert eyes and a restless energy. He paced more than necessary and scribbled faster than anyone could read. But he was sharp and thorough. After reviewing the results, Dr. Harris returned with news that stopped both Mark and Lena in their tracks. "I don't believe this paralysis is permanent," he said. "There's evidence of inflammation in the lower spine, likely due to a rare but treatable condition called transverse myelitis. It mimics permanent paralysis but can improve over time, sometimes fully, sometimes partially." Lena clutched Mark's hand. Mark didn't say anything. He stared at the doctor for a long second, then exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for days. "We'll need time," Dr. Harris added. "Physical therapy, consistent care. It won't be overnight. But there's hope. Hope." That word hung between them, fragile but glowing. By the time they returned home, the sky had begun to pale with early dawn. Exhausted, Lena tucked the baby into his crib, while Mark collapsed on the couch, one arm flung over his eyes. Rusty was curled up near the back door head, lifting the moment the front creaked open. He padded over, nose-twitching, ears forward. Lena knelt and rubbed his head. "Good boy," she whispered. Then she went upstairs to shower, leaving Mark and the baby in the soft-lit living room. Time passed. The house stilled. Then came the sound. Rusty stirred first a muffled shift of something too heavy for comfort. His head rose, muscles tense. He heard the faint creak of wood from the nursery. Not a cry, not a wail, just something wrong. He trotted down the hall and nosed the nursery door open. Inside the crib, sat near the window, pale morning light barely breaking through the curtains. The baby, once sleeping in the middle of the mattress, now lay precariously near the edge, his body twisted sideways between the vertical bars. His head had slipped partway through the railing, tilted dangerously toward the floor neck, bent in an unnatural angle. He was barely awake, limbs still and helpless. Rusty froze, then moved. With soft but purposeful steps, he padded toward the crib. His ears twitched with alertness as he assessed the space. Carefully, he raised his front paws and rested them gently against the crib's outer panel. His nose reached between the bars and nudged the baby's blanket once, twice, trying to guide the child back in. It wasn't enough. The baby slipped further. Rusty whined sharply and pushed forward, squeezing his head through the bars. With all the gentleness his young body could manage, he angled his shoulder to press upward against the baby's side. Bit by bit, the child slid back, inching into safety. In the hallway, Edna Ramsey had just stepped out into her front yard for her usual early watering. The faint, high-pitched whine had caught her ear, something urgent, something canine. She narrowed her eyes toward the Dawson home. A moment later, she heard it again, sharper now. Edna Ramsey didn't run. She hadn't in years. But her feet moved before her thoughts did. She crossed the street nightgown tucked into her coat garden slippers, slapping against pavement. She didn't knock. She pushed the Dawsons' front door open. It was unlocked, and called out, voice trembling. "Mark, Lena." No answer. She followed the sounds down the hall and found Rusty in the nursery, his body half propped on the crib baby, now nestled safely in the center of the mattress again. Mark was just waking in the other room. What's going on?" he mumbled, eyes bleary, as he stumbled toward the noise. Edna turned toward him, her face pale, lips thin with worry. "You'd better secure that crib," she said. "Your dog just saved your child." And Mark blinked. Rusty whined once, then sat down panting. Lena appeared seconds later, towel wrapped around her head, water dripping from her robe. She took in the scene quickly, the open door, Edna standing there, Rusty in the nursery, and her baby asleep once more. Edna looked at Lena, and for the first time since they'd moved in offered something like a smile. "You've got a good one there," she said quietly, nodding toward Rusty. "And I mean both of them." The rhythm of the house changed after that night. It wasn't something loud or dramatic. There were no declarations or ceremonies. It began in the small things, like how Rusty chose to sleep outside the nursery door instead of at the foot of the stairs. How he began rising the moment Noah stirred, padding to the crib to check with quiet eyes and careful steps. He didn't bark anymore when Noah cried. He simply watched, waited, stayed. Lena noticed first. She walked in one morning to find Rusty sitting upright, ears alert, as Noah babbled to himself beneath a mobile of wooden stars. He didn't flinch when she picked the baby up, just moved to follow, tail low but wagging. He followed them to the kitchen, to the changing table, to the backyard for morning sun. Every time Noah was moved, Rusty was a silent escort. "You're his shadow now," Lena murmured one afternoon as she watched Rusty lay his head gently on the edge of the playmat. Noah kicked weakly at a soft rattle, his foot barely grazing the bell. Rusty blinked slowly, then licked the boy's heel with careful reverence. Mark began calling him our little guardian, and the name stuck. Outside the Dawson home, spring had begun to creep through Evergrove. The snow had receded from the eaves. The trees budded with hesitant green. The breeze carried the scent of soil and thaw, and with it something else, warmth. Across the street, Edna Ramsey stood in her small kitchen and watched Rusty through the window. She had lived in the same yellow cottage for 40 years. Since Harold's death, the oven had rarely been used for anything more than reheating soup or baking potatoes. She used to make peach cobbler on Sunday's apple bread in the fall. Harold had loved her cornbread muffins with honey butter, said they reminded him of his mother's. She hadn't made those muffins in years. But that morning, she pulled out the old cookbook, the one with the stained pages and Harold's tiny check marks in the margins. Her hands moved stiffly at first, awkward, uncertain. As she mixed flour and sugar, she paused to glance out the window again. Rusty was laying beside the stroller now, head resting near Noah's foot. The child's tiny fingers reached down toward him, grasping at air. Edna stirred in the cinnamon slowly. By late afternoon, the scent of warm cornbread drifted across Maple Street. She wrapped 6 muffins in a clean towel, placed them in a basket, and stood on her porch for a long moment, heart beating faster than expected. Her garden slippers made soft scuffs on the pavement as she crossed the road. Lena opened the door. Noah in one arm, Rusty sitting dutifully behind her like a sentinel. She blinked in surprise. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Ramsey. I made a little something," Edna said, clearing her throat. "Thought you might enjoy it. It's nothing fancy." Lena stepped aside immediately, her face brightening. "That's very kind of you. Please come in just for a moment if you'd like." Edna hesitated, then nodded once. She entered like someone stepping into a church for the first time in years, reverent, careful, uncertain. The house smelled faintly of baby lotion and fresh coffee. Toys were neatly stacked in a corner. Noah, now propped on a small blanket with a soft cushion behind him, gurgled and kicked as Rusty lay nearby, watching without blinking. "He never leaves his side," Lena said quietly. "It's like he knows something we don't." Edna crouched slowly, her knees stiff from time. She studied Noah's eyes, gray-blue, wide, endlessly curious, and the way Rusty kept a paw resting near his tiny hand. "I think he does," she replied. "Dogs? Some of them just know where they're needed most." From that day forward, Edna Ramsay came every Thursday at 4 o'clock with something warm from her oven. Sometimes it was muffins, sometimes peach turnovers or banana bread. She never stayed long, but each visit lasted a little longer than the last. Once she brought over a small hand-knit blanket, one she had started years ago and never finished. She gave it to Lena without a word, and Lena accepted it with both hands. Noah's strength grew slowly but surely. The doctor's prediction had been cautious, but the signs were there. One morning, as Lena dangled a cloth duck just inches away, he kicked harder than usual. Not just a twitch, but a push. Rusty's head lifted immediately. Lena gasped. Mark came running half-buttoned shirt, coffee forgotten in the hallway. "Look," she said, voice thick with emotion. He moved again. They watched as Noah repeated it. A shaky, deliberate nudge with his foot. Not strong, not quick, but intentional. Rusty barked once, just once, and licked Noah's foot again. The boy let out a tiny laugh, a bubbling sound that filled the room like music. And no one said anything, because no one had to. By late April, the backyard had transformed into a quilt of green and gold. The trees that once stood bare now reached upward with budding leaves casting dappled shadows on the grass. Birds returned in full voice. Bees skimmed the early blossoms, and the scent of freshly turned soil mingled with barbecue smoke drifting from open porches along Maple Street. In the Dawson home, spring had not just arrived, it had bloomed. Noah had grown. At nearly 1 year old, he was no longer the fragile, unmoving bundle they'd received that cold October morning. His hair had thickened into soft, copper-tinged curls. His cheeks were round and always slightly flushed, his fingers constantly grasping at anything in reach. He still couldn't stand, but he could roll sit upright with confidence, and his proudest skill pull himself forward with his arms in a determined scoot that took him from one side of the room to the other in seconds. Lena called it his soldier crawl. Mark called it his daily mission. And always Rusty was there. The now nearly full-grown golden retriever had filled out into a strong, muscular companion with a sleek coat that shimmered under the sun and a gaze that had only grown wiser. Though barely a year old himself, Rusty had matured into something more than a pet. He was Noah's guardian, his shadow, and his favorite toy all in one. Their bond was instinctual, effortless, something deeper than training, older than words. Today was special. Mark had cleared the afternoon, shutting his laptop early. Lena had packed a basket of sandwiches, apples, and iced tea. They spread a blanket beneath the willow tree at the back of the yard, a perfect spot where the grass sloped gently and the sun hung just right. Noah sat at the center, banging 2 plastic cups together with glee. Rusty trotted in playful circles around him, occasionally nudging a cup with his nose or dropping a squeaky ball beside the baby's knee. Lena leaned against Mark, her hand resting on his arm. "Look at him," she whispered. "I swear he's going to stand up one of these days just to chase that dog." Mark laughed. "If he does, I'm not sure which of them will cry harder." They sat in that moment longer than usual, aware of the softness it carried. It had taken them months to reach this kind of peace, months of appointments, adjustments, fears, whispered in the dark. But now there was laughter and space to breathe. Across the street on her own porch, Edna Ramsay stood with a glass of lemonade in hand, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. She had changed too. Gone was the permanent tension in her shoulders, the suspicion in her eyes. In its place was something looser, softer. She still didn't like gossip, still trimmed her hedges with the same military precision. But now, every Thursday, her kitchen smelled of cinnamon and sugar. She asked about Noah's progress with genuine interest, and Rusty had made it his ritual to trot over to her gate at least once a day for a biscuit and a scratch behind the ears. She was watching from the porch when it happened. The doorbell rang. Mark, closest to the house, rose without much thought. It wasn't unusual for neighbors to drop by now. But the moment he opened the front door, his body froze. Standing there was a woman he hadn't seen in nearly 7 months. She was younger than he remembered, though her face was more worn. Her hair, once tangled and wild, was now brushed and tucked behind her ears. She wore a loose denim jacket, jeans, and flat shoes that had seen better days. In one hand, she held a manila envelope, in the other a folded letter. "Hi," she said softly. Mark didn't move. Behind him, Lena stepped into view. Her breath caught in her throat the instant she saw the woman, Noah's mother. Her name had never been known to them, not officially, but now, face to face again, Lena recognized her instantly. The woman didn't ask to come in. She didn't look past them toward the yard. Instead, she offered the envelope, her hand steady. "These are the official custody relinquishment forms," she said. "Signed, notarized. I wanted to give them in person." Lena took the papers silently. The woman's eyes drifted downward, unsure. I needed to know he was okay." There was a long pause. Then Lena nodded. "He is. He's more than okay." The woman swallowed hard. "I don't expect anything. I won't come back. I needed to close this." She handed over the letter, then turned to leave. Lena stepped forward. "Wait." The woman paused. "We don't know what your life was like or what it is now, but thank you for giving him to us, for trusting us." The woman smiled faintly, tears threatening but not falling. She gave a small nod, then walked away. Neither Lena nor Mark followed. Instead, they closed the door gently and returned to the yard. Rusty had sensed something. He stood now, ears alert, eyes fixed on the house until he saw them emerge again. As Lena knelt beside Noah, Rusty trotted over and licked her hand. Then, without hesitation, he turned and darted across the lawn straight to Edna's porch. She knelt, one hand on her knee, and Rusty licked her fingers with a reverence only animals know. She chuckled softly. "I suppose that's your way of saying we're all doing just fine." That evening, after Noah was bathed and asleep, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, her hand resting against her stomach. Mark came in with 2 mugs of tea. "I didn't say anything earlier," she said, voice quiet. Mark tilted his head. "About the woman?" "No," she said, a soft smile touching her lips. "About something else." She looked up. "I'm 8 weeks along." Mark blinked. "Wait, are you saying we're having another baby?" Rusty curled at the foot of the bed, thumped his tail, once then laid his head back down. Sometimes miracles don't come in the form of thunder or grand gestures. Sometimes they arrive quietly, wrapped in a worn blanket, crawling across a picnic blanket, or lying at your feet with golden fur and watchful eyes. This story reminds us that God's grace often moves through the ordinary, through people who open their doors to the unknown, through animals who guard us with unwavering loyalty, and through hearts that heal even after they've been broken. In our everyday lives, we may overlook the small moments that are in truth divine whispers: a child's laugh, a dog's devotion, a neighbor's kindness. But these are the threads God uses to sew hope back into the fabric of our days. So if you believe in second chances, in love that finds its way, and in the quiet miracles that remind us we are never truly alone, share this story. Comment Amen if this touched your heart. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, family, and unconditional love. And may God bless you and your loved ones with quiet miracles of your own.